Today we're going to discuss the 10 benefits of pollinator-friendly solar with Ben Inskeep, who is a principal analyst with EQ Research in Cary, North Carolina. Ben is based in Indianapolis. Welcome to SolarWorks for Illinois, Ben.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Pollinator-friendly solar is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I am a vegetation ecologist originally, and we have lots of ground mount solar happening now in Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. You can't shake a stick without running into large scale solar now in the Midwest. And you've written a wonderful report on pollinator friendly solar in Indiana specifically. And of course it draws upon work going on in other states, and we'll get into that. But so I encourage our readers to go to EQ Research's website and look at this report. So Ben, tell us a little bit about EQ Research and your work there.
Thank you. EQ Research is a policy consulting firm specializing in clean energy policy. So we focus on all 50 states in this country. And we have both databases that track policy, both legislative and regulatory, as well as consulting services. Where we're doing work on all sorts of different clean energy policy projects across the country. Everything from tracking utility integrated resource plans to testifying as expert witnesses in utility rate cases to working on net metering and PURPA avoided cost battles. So we do a full gamut of various policy work relating to solar, wind, energy storage, and other clean energy technologies.
And how did you and EQ Research get interested specifically in pollinator-friendly solar?
Well, pollinator-friendly solar is kind of something I stumbled upon more recently. It kind of goes back to my roots of getting in energy in the first place. Back about a decade ago, I was working as an intern in Yosemite National Park, working on issues like land management and, working on environmental issues. And that kind of drew me into some of the policy concerns when it comes to environmental issues. And so that's when I went back to school to get my master's degrees. And there is when I really started learning much more about climate change and the impacts it was having. And that kind of, naturally drew me into the world of energy and energy policy, because energy has such an important role when it comes to climate change. And so, kind of through that channel, I really focused on energy policy, and that's what I've been focused on for the past 6 years. And so just in the past few years, I think, pollinator-friendly solar, I've started hearing more and more about it as other sort of policy issues were arising for solar, things like, agricultural use in solar on agricultural sites, various concerns with some of the, impacts of solar despite its clean energy electrons it produces, the impacts it has. And so I was naturally kind of drawn to pollinator-friendly solar from that perspective as a potential solution, or at least a tool for mitigating some of the environmental impacts of specific solar sites, and producing additional co-benefits to not just having clean electrons on the grid, but also having projects that provide environmental and other community and social benefits.
Yeah, I feel a real responsibility as a solar installer and solar developer to install projects that are as environmentally friendly as possible. And luckily now we do have this emerging phenomenon of pollinator-friendly scorecards and pollinator-friendly legislation that helps developers or gives developers and installers some guidelines on how to do this the right way. And what I'm learning is that you might initially think that developing pollinator-friendly sites is going to be more expensive than just putting turf grass or gravel on a solar farm. But what I'm learning is that that's not the case at all. The front end and the long-term costs are very analogous. And so you really have no excuse if you're a system owner to pursue pollinator-friendly solar. And of course, we're going to get into a lot of reasons why this is a good, both for the environment and for humanity. So how did this report come about?
Well, this came about as a kind of a collaboration between EQ Research and Fresh Energy. So Fresh Energy has been, doing a lot of work on the pollinator-friendly solar issue across the country. And so this was kind of Indiana is kind of one of the states that has been arguably lagging behind the past few years when it comes to, putting in place new policies that can kind of spur solar development. And so, but it also is a state where there's a tremendous opportunity. Specifically, Indiana, is known as we, just a decade ago or so, I think we were close to 90% of our electricity was coming from coal plants. Well, a lot's changed. We're down to 70% now, and utilities are planning on retiring in the neighborhood of 10,000 megawatts of coal-fired power plants in the next 15 years or so. So there's this tremendous opportunity for new types of energy to replace that coal-fired power in our state as we transition to different energy sources. So I think we're kind of poised right now to consider how do we want the solar development to take place in Indiana. Do we, and so because we are slightly behind when it comes to developing large-scale solar projects, we're also in a position now to kind of actively plan ahead of how we want that solar to look like in our state. We don't have an existing large arrays to the extent that some of the other, other states do. So now I think is a great time as utilities are, beginning to now transition to different energy sources and consider, building out a lot of solar. Now's a great time to plan actively for that solar to be pollinator friendly to the maximum extent that it makes sense to.
Yeah, it's interesting how different factors drive solar in different regions. And, historically I've thought of renewable portfolio standards as being a major causal factor for renewables, and they are. Sure. And yeah. We have a 25% RPS here in Illinois, and it was, it did jumpstart development of particularly wind, but then it quickly fell apart, and it was quote unquote broken until we got FEJA, which is funding SRECs, which are renewable energy credits, which 1 megawatt hour of electricity produced by a renewable energy facility is 1 REC, and so that's a very strong incentive driving solar in Illinois. We had about 200 megawatts just a few years ago, so we were slightly behind Indiana, probably actually. I think Indiana has around 350 megawatts. But what's happening in Indiana is quite different. Tell us about that landscape.
Definitely, yeah. So I think there's some similarities with Indiana being next door to Illinois in terms of our geography, in terms of agricultural being a big part of the state, in terms of coal-fired power plants having a legacy here. We both have footprints in MISO and PJM, but then there's some tremendously important differences. We're not a retail choice state. We don't have deregulation, and so here in Indiana, one of the principal policy drivers, I think, is utility integrated resource planning. And that process underwent some changes relatively recently that really created a much more robust stakeholder process, much more robust utility plans when it comes to planning out and charting out their energy and capacity needs going forward. And so I think one of the, really watershed moments was in 2018 when when NIPSCO, which is a utility up in northern Indiana near the Chicago region, if that helps place us for folks that aren't familiar with Indiana's geography, they released an integrated resource plan that found that it was going to save billions of dollars for their customers to retire their coal-fired power plants much quicker than anticipated, and replace all of that capacity with clean energy resources and other market purchases. So, recently they issued probably is the largest solar solicitation I've seen, which is for 2,300 megawatts. And so that's kind of been one of the drivers in Indiana is utilities like NIPSCO that are now providing these plans that are actually looking at the costs of maintaining existing coal-fired power plants, and finding that, based on where things are, based on competitive solicitations, they can see that they can replace that power with solar and wind resources. So that's kind of where we are right now, is that utilities are kind of at this turning point where they have all this existing generation, but they're seeing that what, a lot of it is no longer cost effective, and so a lot of stakeholders are pushing them in that direction to make sure they're including kind of proper assumptions about solar in those plans. But overall, now we're seeing that these utilities are saying that they're going to build more than 6,000 megawatts of solar just in the next decade in Indiana, and that's just our 5 investor-owned utilities. That's not including our 2 generation and transmission cooperatives, or for example, the Indiana Municipal Power Agency that procures as the wholesale supplier for municipal utilities here. And that's also not including things like net meter projects behind the meter generation and C&I, PPAs or other types of ways of procuring solar generation. So basically, I think right now Indiana is poised for a large solar boom in the coming decade if we can get the policy right and not do anything that's going to jeopardize that by keeping coal plants online longer than is economic to do so.
Yeah, when that NIPSCO RFP came out last year for 2,900 megawatts, that was an eye popper. And that's a very large procurement of solar. But this is a trend we are seeing in Minnesota. Xcel Energy was one of the first to announce that they are going to transition away from coal to wind and solar. Alliant Energy in Wisconsin is now in the news, making major plans on the same tack, basically transitioning away from coal to wind and solar and storage. This is a wonderful tailwind, I call it, to the renewable energy industry. The RPSs are a foundation in many places, and those continue to be very important. And we see over 100 cities and states now have 100% renewable portfolio standard goals. We're striving for that here in Illinois. We have legislation in the works to expand our RPS, but it takes time. So it's great when there are other economic forces like these utilities that own the power generating infrastructure in a region, and they just decide it's going to be more economical, it's going to save our consumers money. What's holding us back? And it's just pure economics, even though it is a win for the environment and human health and nature, as we'll see here. It is at the end of the day, this is a bottom line decision. Definitely.
I think that's really been what's been groundbreaking for the solar energy industry is the cost effectiveness argument. Indiana doesn't have that RPS, and I would echo your point that RPS policies have been absolutely critical and are definitely a great option for states to pursue. But for states that don't have an RPS, like Indiana, and where you might have political headwinds on that specific policy, there are other avenues for promoting solar. And I think one of them is transparent utility planning that uses good assumptions, that have good stakeholder processes, that have commissions that take it seriously and hold utilities' feet to the fire if they're not doing a good job in how they're planning and justifying their assumptions.
And you mentioned in your intro about EQ Research that you have now this database on IRPs. So for developers who are looking at the bleeding edge of where is solar and wind and storage going to happen, check out that database that EQ Research has. That is a treasure trove truly of where the market is going. So let's circle back now. Why is pollinator-friendly solar important?
It's a great question. I think a lot of folks, maybe who don't have a environmental or ecological focused background, might wonder that very question. Wonder, who cares about, bumblebees and, moths and that kind of stuff. Well, the answer is because these are actually, absolutely critical species. They're keystone species. And what that means is pollinators are absolutely critical to the entire health of the ecosystem. If your pollinator population crashes, which is happening right now with honeybees and other species, it can have really dire chain reaction on the entire ecosystem. Not to mention, just from kind of a selfish human perspective, a lot of our food comes from pollinators and is dependent on pollinators and the services that they provide. Talking about your fruits and nuts and other types of vegetables and plants that rely on pollinators for our food and nutrition. So it's absolutely critical that we maintain these populations and that we work to reverse the really scary trend we're seeing right now with a lot of populations crashing due to threats like climate change, due to threats like the loss of habitat, and also the use of widespread insecticides like neonicotinoids, which are killing honeybees and other important species. So the bottom line is that pollinator-friendly solar is kind of a nice way to capture the co-benefits of having clean electricity that also, has the site itself being beneficial to the environment, and as a way to kind of make a project, to highlight the benefits of a project, make it more socially acceptable in places where you might have pushback from folks on solar siting issues. And it's just a great way to have other environmental positive benefits while, at the same time, potentially benefiting the bottom line over the long term. As you mentioned, what you're seeing, there's a concern maybe with pollinator-friendly solar. Does this require, more expensive practices or more, added upfront costs? And I think what we're seeing with a lot of experience from developers is that either the cost is very small, or that the costs are more than made up by the long-term benefits that it provides from a financial perspective to a project, things like reduced maintenance costs over the long term, as well as other, benefits that the project provides to the site specifically.
Yeah, pollinator-friendly solar is truly a win-win-win. And yes, solar is a land use change. Here in the Midwest, we are largely taking what is today cropland and converting it to solar farms. And while you might say, well, why on earth would we take America's breadbasket and convert it to solar farms? But the reality is that we are talking about a tiny fraction of the landscape. I've done many calculations on this, and I've been looking at various and sundry studies. For the United States to go 100% clean energy, we just need 1 to 2% of the landscape. We've already converted 6% of the landscape to cities, roads, buildings, the built infrastructure. We have tons of land. Another thing that we're in denial about is what we are using our land for. 40% of our land area in the United States is in some way related to cattle grazing or feeding cattle, not one foodstuff. And so here in the Midwest, we're talking about converting a fraction of a percent, maybe 0.3% of the land, of cropland, to solar farms. And then you're taking what is industrial cropland, corn and beans mostly, but a variety of crops, and then converting it to a solar farm where if it's done well, right, if it's truly an ecologically friendly planted solar farm, let's say shortgrass prairie, you're mowing minimally, right? So there's very little wear and tear on the land. You're using very few chemicals because you're using native plant species. In the early years of the establishment, you have to do some chemical and mechanical control for sure. But that land then is going to be a solar farm for several decades, perhaps 3 decades, perhaps longer if they re-energize it, right? And then you have organic farm ground. So the land is actually going to be worth more, but the benefits to the land and the community are multiple, right? You're creating habitat for pollinators, you're creating habitat for wildlife like birds and amphibians. You're reducing runoff. Runoff is a big problem, right? Stormwater runoff in the Midwest is a big issue because the land is very flat and water pollution is a major concern. So you want as little of the water running off the land as possible. And if you plant prairie plants, they have very deep roots, much deeper than crop plants. And they're going to help the water soak into the ground. And so it's going to be a win-win-win. So I'm just super passionate for this topic. It's high time, and it's such a wonderful way to convert. You think of converting truly dirty industrial facilities of just focus on coal, right? That is at least probably 50% of our grid power here in the Midwest, to solar farms, wind farms, and battery storage facilities. It's night and day. You collaborated with Fresh Energy for this report. I've gotten to know Rob Davis, and he came on the show, so you can check out Rob Davis on my YouTube channel, but if you also just Google Rob Davis, he is the director of the Center for Pollinators and Energy at Fresh Energy in Minnesota. Rob has become a national leader on this topic. So you found a great partner in Fresh Energy, and you've done you just published this report back in May. So now we have 6.4 gigawatts of solar coming into Indiana in the next decade, right?
At least.
And that has land use implications. So let's talk a little more about that, the land use and economic impacts of this transition that is going on in Indiana and the Midwest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, like, specifically on that land use issue, I think you raised a really good point about how folks have expressed concerns about those land use implications. But when you look at those numbers, the impact of solar itself is not significant. Like you mentioned, less than 1% of the land would actually be going to solar. So it's Indiana specifically, we ran those numbers in this report to verify that, and found that yes, even if this 6.4 gigawatts plus is built, and even if it's all built on prime farmland in the state, which obviously there's other land as well, it would still incorporate less than 1% of that. So certainly, I think we do need to consider those land use implications. We are losing a lot of farmland to other types of development, specifically. And solar is not the major problem when it comes to our loss of our really critical agricultural farmland. And as you pointed out, it actually can keep that land as a potential use for farmland in the future by having those kind of native vegetation that has those deep roots. You're building that water capacity of the soil. You're putting more organic matter into the soil, and you're not putting a bunch of gravel or some other alternative at the site that could make it difficult to rehabilitate the land in the future. So I think it is really important to consider those land use impacts, and I think that's one of the prime benefits of pollinator-friendly solar is that you are it is a disturbance on the land. There are impacts of it. But it really goes a long way to help mitigate a lot of those impacts, and forces all the actors involved in a project to consider those implications and to plan for them and to actively consider how they can reduce their impact. From the get-go of a project, how do we need to design this project to make sure we can mow effectively, a couple times a year when we need to, and how do we make sure that we're creating a benefit for the community and not, and kind of heading off some of the concerns about creating what some folks might see as just an industrial site located in a rural area. So there's all these types of, I think, benefits to having a site be pollinator friendly, and for developers to consider in the design phase of their project, how can we build this in and incorporate it into our project.
Indeed. It just takes a little planning and thoughtfulness. And I have noticed that many of the developers in Illinois are glomming on to pollinator-friendly solar. So when you develop a scorecard and you create legislation that incentivizes pollinator-friendly solar, it really does work, because the developers understand that in the consumer's eye, in the farmer's eye, this is going to be a more attractive kind of development than a more industrial, like you see behind me, turf grass, which that particular site, that's exactly what was there. We just left the turf that was on that site. Mm-hmm. This is in an industrial park, so it's not taking a farm field and converting it to solar. It was already converted to an industrial park, and we're just putting a solar array on that field. But what's going on with pollinators, though? Because I have been seeing an increasing drumbeat from the scientific community raising the alarm on everything from butterflies to honeybees, of course. Those are the two that we hear the most about, but there's actually a litany of news about pollinators. What's the story there, Ben?
Yeah, pollinators are kind of under threat from a confluence of factors. Like I mentioned, I think, one of the big ones is that loss of habitat. That's impacting, all species right now as we, become further developed. So that loss of habitat is definitely a big driver, but also climate change, impacting, the seasons, the variability of weather, and among other impacts is also, decimated populations. And then furthermore, you have the widespread use of insecticides that are really decimating these populations and making them more susceptible, I think, to additional threats. So you do see what folks have been calling a collapse of the colonies when it comes to things like honeybees. And honeybees, I think, are one of the most important of the pollinator species. But as you said, they're not the only ones. There are thousands of species of pollinators out there. And so as these populations have faced these threats, their populations have really declined dramatically in the last couple decades. And so that's really what's kind of opened up a lot of people's eyes to this issue, is just that kind of rapid and dramatic decline in those populations. And then thinking through like all the services that pollinators provide to our way of life, and what the implications are going to be if this population decline trend continues. It's going to have a dramatic impact on our ability to procure nutrition and food to feed ourselves, not to mention the other negative impacts it's going to have on our ecosystems in general. So that's why this is really an important thing to consider, is because this is really one of the major environmental issues that we're seeing that could have really far and wide-reaching impacts across a lot of sectors and on our economy, not to mention those environmental impacts.
So in this report, you highlight 10 benefits of solar. Those include benefits for pollinators, right? And we have to remember that it's not just about saving birds and bees for the sake of the birds and the bees. While that is valuable,
right.
It's saving the pollinators because of the economic impact of pollinators. We depend on foodstuffs that are dependent themselves on pollinators. And there's a correlation between the abundance of pollinators and the abundance of foodstuffs, or the abundance of a particular crop. The crop is actually impacted by the density of pollinators. But let's walk through the benefits, soup to nuts. What are the benefits of pollinator-friendly solar as you lay them out in this report?
Sure, yeah. So I kind of lump them into three general categories. You have your economic benefits, your environmental benefits, and then your social benefits. So when it comes to the economics of a project, first you have the opportunity for long-term cost savings by just having reduced maintenance costs. That is weighed against maybe what could be a higher upfront cost when it comes specifically to the type of seeds you're getting. If you're buying native seeds versus alternatives, that could have a slight premium. But other impacts of having a pollinator-friendly site often outweigh those and provide additional benefits. You also have potential for increased efficiency of the solar panels. This is something I had no idea coming into this research project was a thing. But in researching it, it sounds really exciting. It sounds like we need to do a lot more research on this. But it follows that if you have native vegetation, water-rich species surrounding the solar panels and not blocking them, obviously, it could create an effect where the ambient temperatures are lower. And so, during high temperature periods, like in the summer, you're going to have higher efficiency in your solar modules. And so we have had a couple initial studies that show that effect, and it can be a few percentage points when it comes to your efficiency gains. You also have other positive economic benefits, things like potential for honey production at the site. You could co-locate apiary next to or joining a solar site where you actually have bees, honeybees that can generate honey that can be marketed, as honeybees that are helping out solar. So there's that kind of positive benefit there. When it comes to your environmental benefits, the three I kind of highlight in the report, and I think there are plenty of additional ones too. But those are improved water quality, reduced erosion, and creating habitat for native species. So just on the concept, I want to highlight, the reduced erosion and water quality issue, because those are issues, particularly in the Midwest, where we do have a lot of fertilizer runoff into our waterways. That as a result of the nitrogen and phosphorus running into our waterways, you do create downstream the potential for dead zones that are really catastrophic for an ecosystem. And then in addition to those environmental benefits, you have what I kind of characterize as social benefits. And so those can be a variety of benefits, such as just improved aesthetics of your projects, making it look more natural as opposed to an industrial site. Potential for greater community support if you can really market your project as something that's creating these benefits in the local community, increased environmental benefits and so on. But then, I think just from a broader perspective, I think it's a great opportunity for those in the solar industry to tell their story. It helps with the narrative. It helps create this topic for folks to latch onto and really grasp some of the greater implications of solar and how it can really, have benefits not just in terms of reducing, coal pollution or having clean electrons on the grid, but also how it can play a greater role in having a healthy ecosystem and having a site be embraced by a community as being something that fits more into the natural aesthetic.
Indeed. So I feel strongly about those who are most impacted by any form of development. And in this case, farming communities are at the epicenter of this transition. While it is a small percentage of the landscape, if you are sited near, or if you live near a large solar project, I have a 1,200 acre solar farm that's being developed in the county where I live in central Illinois. And it is controversial, right? You're taking land that has for generations been beans and corn and converting it to what most people consider a very industrial use, a solar farm. And it is an industrial use. It is creating a power plant. But at the end of the day, it is steel piles that are typically driven into the land. So it's just steel stuck in the ground, and then glass that is mounted on top of that, and then wires and some electronics, and then a connection to the grid. So all of that can be torn out at the end of its lifetime, 25 or 30 years. And really there's very, very little long-term impact on the land if it's done right and maintained in an environmentally friendly manner. But what is the impact on farming communities? And I want to preface this also with a comment about income. A lot of farmland is farmed by non-resident farmers. Okay, these are farmers that are renting the land from the landowner and then growing crops. In central Illinois, which is some of the best farm ground in the world, bar none, a farmer is getting approximately $300 an acre per year for prime ground. They can rent that ground to a solar farmer for at least $900 an acre, sometimes as much as $1,200 an acre.
Yeah.
And so the farmer's tripling their income by leasing their land to a solar farmer, and they're maintaining ownership. The solar farmers don't want to buy the land typically. They just want a 25 or 30-year lease.
Yeah.
But what are the other benefits or impacts on farming communities?
It's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of our farming communities in the Midwest are really suffering, especially the past couple of years. They were hit really hard by tariffs on various agricultural products. We also dealt with a lot of flooding, I think last year in particular, that decimated a lot of crops. And as climate change is going to continue to get worse, that's going to further create negative impacts on agricultural and growing crops here. So, and that's going to further hurt farmers. So I think one of the benefits of that solar can bring to this equation is, for starters, just as you mentioned, the economic benefits of leasing land for solar use can be a really important and stable financial income stream for the landowner. It can help ensure that kind of stability that then allows them to keep other parts of their property in use for agricultural uses by having a portion of it be for a solar farm. That it's kind of diversifying your crops, if you will. It's to have solar, or you have solar, you have corn, and you have soybeans. It kind of helps in that whole diversification. So if one sector is hit, the others still provide you income. So that's one of the big ones, I think, is it just kind of provides an economic benefit directly. It also can create, it's also a form of economic development in rural communities that often right now, are struggling to find significant economic development opportunities as A lot of them continue to be focused in more urban areas. So this could be, an opportunity to build something that's, or to develop something in a sustainable way that doesn't, that's not something more permanent like a shopping mall or a residential subdivision that is going to permanently take the farmland out of use, that is going to permanently change the landscape in a meaningful way. And that could be the alternative to a solar facility. So I think it's important to, consider your counterfactual. Is, if the solar farm isn't going to be built, well, what's going to happen? Is the land necessarily going to stay in agricultural use? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's going to go to something that's worse and even more, has additional issues with it that at least a solar facility can mitigate through things like pollinator-friendly practices. So I think these are great questions, and I think there are a lot of complexities in dealing with these issues, because I think we do need to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of rural communities, there are a lot of folks that live there because they do like that rural aesthetic, and they do strongly feel that they don't want that aesthetic changed meaningfully in a way that is going to turn it into an industrial site. So I think that's kind of where some of these kind of wise site practices and management practices can come into play. Things like native vegetation, things like fencing and shielding with species that are kind of native and fit in with the community aesthetic, and that otherwise you can point to a community and be like, this is helping you in these ways. It's helping with the runoff problem from your other agricultural sites. It's helping boost your pollinator population, so you don't have the same concerns with various agricultural products. So I think there's a number of ways that you can point to pollinator-friendly solar as kind of helping these agricultural communities in a time of kind of unparalleled volatility.
Yeah, it's interesting that in other parts of the world, we refer to solar as solar parks or solar fields. And the term solar farm has kind of stuck in the US, but if local and state policies are done well, you can have a very aesthetically as well as ecologically effective solar field, but you have to put that into policy. I'm developing a project right now in the Joliet area, which is in the southwest, just about an hour southwest of Chicago. And the local ordinance requires us to screen the solar farm. It's a 15-acre solar farm, but they have some rules that really don't lend itself to creating what I would consider to be a park-like setting. They want us to basically screen the facility from the public eye. They want a fence that is not see-through. And they have a very limited range of types of landscaping that they want to see around the perimeter of the array. So we're in the early days, and of course there's going to be an evolution of our knowledge and understanding and best practices. But what are some of the best practices for pollinator-friendly solar?
Yeah, so I think, some of the best practices for sites specifically would include things like, from the get-go, planning your site to be pollinator-friendly. So making sure your panel spacing allows for mowing, making sure your cabling and wiring between panels is underground or whatever to allow for mowing of that vegetation. Again, you're not going to be mowing on a regular basis throughout the year, because that would kind of defeat the point of a pollinator site if you're mowing through your pollinator species every week or two. But you are going to mow probably, like for example in the fall, kind of just get everything down. And you are going to mow if there's an issue with plants rising above the panels and creating shading. But on that issue, you also want to make sure your panels are sited at least 36 inches above the ground, allow for that growth to happen of these pollinator species without creating that shading on your panels. And then there's just a whole host of other additional considerations that experts on this specific topic have created best practices, best management kind of guides that go into really the technical specifications and recommendations for specific sites. So we have a few of those guides that have already been produced in Indiana and that are being worked on right now by the Purdue Agricultural Extension. Other states have also created this kind of technical guidance. And I think that really goes hand in hand with the other policy recommendations we have, is to make sure when you're creating a pollinator habitat scorecard, make sure we're providing solar developers with the set of information and resources they need to be able to effectively implement that. Make sure they know how to get native seeds and what species they want to be planting and what other state specific or regional specific considerations do you want to be considering for your specific solar site, because each state, each region, each geographic location is going to have a different set of best management practices when it comes to that site specifically, in terms of the species you're planting, in terms of other types of things that you want to factor in. So again, I think our report kind of lays out a lot of those resources and points developers in the direction of where you can get more information on those specifics, how you can consider this in your planning process for your site, and then what you need to do throughout the life of your project to maintain that site, and to make sure you're not just planting seeds at the beginning and hoping for the best, and then not doing anything after that. It takes a little bit more active management to make sure the native seeds are actually doing their job, and that issues that arise are being addressed as they come up.
Yeah, you mentioned a few things that are that really ring true for me. The panel height is a key one. You want to have the low edge of the panels no lower than 36 inches, whether it's fixed, ground mount, or tracker. And a majority of the new projects coming into the Midwest are going to be trackers. That's totally doable, and you just have to plan for it. It's also a good practice here in the Midwest because we do have substantial snow loads, and you just don't want the bottom edge of the array running into that problem. But you want the equipment to be able to get underneath the array, and you don't want the plants to shade the array, but you want to have access to a diversity of species. And prairie plants come in all shapes and sizes, of course, and unfortunately, you can't do tall grass prairie, which much of the Midwest was prior to European settlement, but you can do short grass prairie, and then you can do selective mowing. You do a high mow, so a 6-inch or a 10-inch mow. You don't have to take it down to 4 inches. There's just no need, right? And so the plants can come back faster and get back to that stage where they're producing flowers, which is critical, of course, for the pollinators who are feeding on the nectar and then also functioning as pollinators and helping to spread the seed. You want the plants to reseed themselves. So if they're not going to seed, that's also a challenge as far as, getting the whole thing established. So you have to be smart about this, and you have to hire contractors who really know about native vegetation. And luckily there is a blossoming ecosystem, pun intended, of ecological consultants, environmental engineering firms, and landscaping firms that specialize in ecological restoration, supplying seed, and that is an industry which is now actually quite mature. You just have to look for it and you'll find it. So this report focuses on Indiana, but it draws on the work that's going on in other places like Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, especially around scorecards, but just touch a little bit on what is going on in other places and where are we doing it right, so to speak, and what states have become a beacon of hope?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the exciting things about this topic is it's relatively newer on the policy spectrum. So we are still kind of figuring out, what policies work, what type of policies we want to implement to, incentivize pollinator-friendly solar. So there's still a lot of experimentation, a lot of new ideas being floated at the local and state level. I think, to start off with, one of the pioneers of this topic has been the state of Minnesota. They developed the first scorecard that kind of looks at habitat, that allows developers to kind of do a habitat assessment of their site and their plans. And then to, if they meet specific criteria, they can then claim the benefit of being a pollinator-friendly site and market themselves as that. And then once you have that type of habitat assessment scorecard in place and created by a state, which again, Indiana is working on right now, I think the Purdue University Extension is working on that scorecard for our state so we can follow the lead of states like Minnesota and Illinois that have already developed this. Then you can implement additional policies that rely on that scorecard. So for example, local governments in their siting or permitting, they can require or otherwise encourage or incentivize developers to use that scorecard to site their project. And you can have states like Massachusetts that are implementing pollinator-friendly solar in their incentive programs. So you can actually get an additional incentive, financial incentive, if your site is pollinator-friendly. And then you have, I guess, a variety of other states that are, just kind of using this tool as a voluntary designation that allows developers to, get good press, good coverage as, being pollinator-friendly and a good environmental steward by going through this kind of habitat assessment scorecard and managing their site effectively, as the project continues. So, there's, I think, a variety of different policies. One more, I guess, would be in Michigan, where there is, a tax abatement program that allows farmers to, reduce their taxes if they're preserving their agricultural land for agricultural uses. And the Michigan governor recently opened up that program to allow some of that agricultural land to be developed for solar purposes if that solar is pollinator friendly, without that landowner then being subject to back taxes as a result of that land turning into a solar use. So, there's just a variety of different ways and policy levers that state and local governments can use to encourage this kind of best practices. It can be voluntary, it can be mandatory, it can be, flexible, it can be more rigid. Certainly, there's a lot of, opportunity then, I think, for folks to engage on this type of policy right now and make sure we're, implementing, some of the best practices and that we're bringing in developer perspectives, making sure we're not creating a new set of onerous or expensive regulations, but we're actually creating a solid policy foundation that will actually allow this kind of practice to flourish and not, jeopardize projects or create undue financial burdens. So I think, that's kind of one of the important considerations as we're doing this, is to make sure we're incorporating that flexibility while still meeting some, basic minimum guidelines. And folks aren't, just phoning it in when it comes to creating a pollinator-friendly site.
I'm curious, who is going to carry the torch in Indiana to really get this across the finish line? I don't believe Indiana has a scorecard, for example. What's going on the policy front and on the scorecard front in Indiana?
Yeah, I think Indiana, we're a state that, kind of is more reluctant to implement policies that are perceived as a mandate or a stringent regulation, and more, in a state that likes, have voluntary kind of policy nudges. So, the Purdue Agricultural Extension is developing that scorecard now, and I believe that is planned to be released soon this year at some point in time. So we will have that scorecard. And, I think when it comes to who's going to help carry this policy forward, I think several types of general groups of stakeholders. You definitely have your critical, kind of environmental advocates, folks like the Nature Conservancy and the Hoosier Environmental Council, Sierra Club, among others, who are, kind of pushing for these types of, sound policies to be implemented. You have utilities as well, who are, issuing these RFPs for new resources as part of their integrated resource plans. And they've, at least some of them have expressed an interest in including this type of criteria in their RFPs, or at least requesting information from developers on how the site's going to be managed and if it's going to be a pollinator-friendly site. So you have that kind of, kind of incentive for folks to make sure they're, incorporating this type of thing in their projects. And then right now our siting regime in Indiana is, very local and determined at the local level. We could see some interesting developments on the legislative front in 2021 when it comes to renewable energy siting, because that has been a focal point and subject to numerous kind of local county by county policy battles where you had a series of moratoriums and other bans on renewable energy or at least temporary moratoriums on new solar facilities in certain counties as the local government was reacting to all of a sudden, going from no solar to somebody saying, hey, can we build a 200 megawatt solar project here? So all of a sudden they have to get all their ducks in a row and learn about solar and consider whether or not their existing siting is appropriate for going from no solar to all of a sudden it being kind of a widespread use. So those are some of the key, I guess, actors when it comes to how we're going to get this policy in place and what we're going to do moving forward. And then, of course, just the initiative of solar developers in the state to incorporate a lot of these best management practices in their sites voluntarily.
Yeah, you mentioned local ordinances, and we went through this in Illinois because we got FEJA, the Future Energy Jobs Act, which was passed in 2016, went into force in 2017, and it's really now just taking hold. But literally every county has to develop their own solar ordinance. That's a double edge, right? Because some of them do it well, and some of them work with knowledgeable professionals who've been there, done that, or consultants. But some of them just dig in and basically try to obstruct solar development or wind development. Mm-hmm. And in the county I live in Champaign County, they developed a wind ordinance that was restrictive. And so as a result, we don't have wind farms in Champaign County. We have wind farms all around us. Luckily, they saw the light and they came close to developing a solar ordinance that was not friendly, but at the end of the day, they did develop one that was friendly, and we are getting some nice solar projects in Champaign County now. But you think about, in the Midwest, we probably have 1,000 counties.
Sure.
We have over 100 counties in Illinois, and the inefficiency of that. So there's a tremendous need for model policies, and you do include some model ordinances in your report. So I'm grateful for that, and really encourage our listeners to check out this report from EQ Research. Ben, tell us a little more about what else EQ Research is up to, and how can listeners get a hold of you guys?
Sure. Just type in EQ Research into your search bar, and our website will pop up. We're eq-research.com. I also have a very active Twitter presence online. If you want to get in touch with me on Twitter, I'm at Ben_Inskeep. But EQ Research is working on a variety of different projects right now. One of our most recent services that we launched is the integrated resource planning tracker that we're doing that has all utility integrated resource plans across the country, and we're updating that on a monthly basis. So we are kind of tracking the landscape when it comes to how utilities are planning for replacing coal-fired generation and other old existing generation with new resources like solar. We're very involved in utility rate cases, net metering, lots of other solar policies that we track as part of our legislative and regulatory tracking services. And then we're involved in a number of specific proceedings on behalf of various clients. So, and then lastly, I'll mention is a lot of work I do also is with the community choice aggregation programs out in California. So some of them are also getting involved in making sure their solar projects are pollinator friendly as well. So there's lots of different ways that we're working on clean energy here in this country on the policy side of things.
Well, we're grateful for your work, and it's just great to get to know you a little bit, and I look forward to having you back on the show as things develop. It is very much a dynamic landscape. What other resources should our listeners be aware of? We've mentioned Fresh Energy, and they are a great resource. And I will be publishing a bibliography on my website, cesenergynrg.com, on the podcast page. I also have a pollinator-friendly working group. The working group has ebbed and flowed over the last couple of years. It's a little dormant right now, but I'm working on bringing that back. If there's any developers out there who are interested in pollinator-friendly solar and learning from a peer network, like NG, for example. NG is kind of a shining star as far as a developer goes. They're doing hundreds and hundreds of acres of pollinator-friendly solar. What other resources are you aware of that our listeners should know about?
Yeah, we definitely tried to include a pretty extensive bibliography within our report to highlight a lot of these fantastic resources, many of which have been developed just in the last year because of just how new this type of policy is for a lot of folks. So I definitely highlight Fresh Energy, the Center for Pollinators in Energy at Fresh Energy. They've done a lot of pioneering work on this topic. Also recently, reports that I'd highlight include one by the Electric Power Research Institute, the EPRI. They did a pollinator-friendly solar report that has a lot of great resources there and information there as well. The Clean Energy States Alliance, CISA, they recently also put out a report. And then check out some state-specific scorecards that we link to in our report, as well as technical guidance. So if you're looking for technical guidance, states like Minnesota have issued these really great technical reports that kind of go through the nuts and bolts of the very technical specifications of how to design these sites and what species to use, what other considerations you have. In Indiana, it's the Michiana Area Council of Governments, MACOG. They have released that kind of technical guidance up for Northern Indiana that I think other groups in Indiana are working to expand to create a statewide guidance. So those types of I think those types of resources would be really helpful for folks that are interested in really diving into this topic in more detail.
Yeah, and some of the national labs are doing great research on this. Argonne National Lab up in the Chicago area is participating in an NREL study. That's the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So check those out, and those will be on my website as well. There you have it. 10 benefits of pollinator-friendly solar. This is an ongoing story that we will continue to bring to our listeners here on Solar Works for Illinois. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Please go to our YouTube channel, go to our website, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube channel, tell your friends about Solar Works for Illinois, and if you have ideas for topics or guests that you'd like to see me bring on the show, please do reach out to me on Twitter at TGMontague or by email tmontague@cesnrg.com. Thank you so much, Ben Inskeep. It's been great to have you on the show, and I wish you good luck in your future work.
Thank you so much. Great talking with you.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Take care.